So our presentation today for this Wisconsin Council of Churches webinar is how to preach during an election season without blowing up your church. We've had a lot of questions from folks about how to manage in one of the most politically polarized states in the Union in order to preach the gospel without getting into a position where folks call you out for being more about politics than being about faith. So we're really looking forward to this conversation today because Reverend Wes Granberg-Michaelson has an awful lot of experience with these topics, has a lot of experience with public theology as well. He's currently chair of the board of directors at Sojourners. He's been part of its ministry for 40 years. 17 years as General Secretary of the Reformed Church in America, which is one of our member traditions in the Wisconsin Council of Churches. Strong commitment to ecumenism and public theology. He served at the World Council of Churches, the Global Christian Forum, Christian Churches Together, and he's also been an executive and legislative assistant in his career. So I could spend this whole hour reading about his credentials, or I could let you talk to him. So, Wes, I'm so glad you've given us an hour of your time today, and I will let you take over the screen. Why don't you tell us a little bit more about yourself and what you have to share with us in this very, very fraught time?
Well, thanks very much, Carrie. It's really a thrill to be with you, with the Wisconsin Council of Churches. I grew up in Park Ridge, Illinois, which is a suburb of Chicago, but my grandfather had a cottage on Lake Geneva. So all my summers were going up to Wisconsin and Lake Geneva. And then as a young boy, I was raised in a strong evangelical tradition. And the camp I went to was Honey Rock Camp, which was a camp of Wheaton College. It's up by Three Lakes. And I have fond memories there. Both my kids went there. I would confess that my theological framework is a little different now than it was when I attended Honey Rock Camp, but I'm still grateful. And I appreciate the opportunity to be with those of you from Wisconsin. I know that for pastors today, this is just a terribly difficult time. Carrie's already mentioned some of the reasons. I think that we all feel this election is different. It's not just a choice between different political philosophies, but it goes deeper and raises graver questions about the nature of our society and the responsibility of the church and of Christians in that time. And that adds just a real level of pressure. And then you put on top of that COVID-19, which has disrupted the life of every one of the 350,000 congregations in North America. So every one of your congregations has been disrupted. Every one of your congregations is going to change because of COVID-19. The question is, what kind of change will that be? And then in addition to that, we find ourselves in this time of racial reckoning that has really been thrust upon us by events, including those which you've experienced so closely in Wisconsin. And on top of all that, as Carrie said, we're in an unbelievably polarized time. You experienced that intensely in Wisconsin, but it's experienced throughout the country. So when I talk to pastors, I really empathize with the situation they find themselves in today. I think, however, we face two choices. One is to say, well, we're going to preach the gospel, we're going to preach about our faith, and we're just going to stay out of politics. Because that's what many of our parishioners ask for. But for many, that doesn't seem completely satisfying. And the other choice is to say, how can we address biblically and theologically the issues before our country without appearing to be taking a partisan position politically? That is a much finer needle to thread. It's tough, but that's the way that I would encourage you to try to go. And I want to illustrate that. It is, I think, crucial that we in the church learn how to frame the issues we're facing in theological and biblical ways, and to turn the conversation away from political rhetoric to biblical and theological rhetoric. And I want to give you probably 5 quick examples. The first is the issue of voter suppression and the ability to vote. Now, this has become a hot button political issue. We all know that. But I would suggest you frame this in a much deeper way. What is at stake here is the image of God in every person. That's what all of us should be concerned about, regardless of our partisan political position. We are called to respect the image of God in everyone. And in a democratic society, that means respecting the right for their voices to be heard, and to be heard equally, and for guaranteeing that access, supporting that because of how we value, from a biblical point of view, God's image in each and every person. And then there are nonpartisan ways to enter into this question. If you're interested, I'd encourage you to go to the website of Lawyers and Collars. Collars being like a clerical collar, COLLARS. This is an initiative that several historic Black churches and the organization whose board I chair, Sojourners, and others are deeply involved in trying to have a presence of both lawyers and preachers at polling places, to be a watchful and securing presence there. But that's the first, voter suppression. This is an issue of the image of God in every person. Second is this intense moment of racial reckoning that you've been dealing with so deeply there in Wisconsin. Here's how I would suggest you might think of approaching that. In elections, what's happened is that religious issues in the secular framework are normally labeled as 3 things: abortion, gay marriage, and religious liberty. So in effect, one point of view has really dominated the agenda of defining what is a religious issue. Now, all 3 of those issues have religious dimensions, very worthy of discussion. But I'd ask this question. At this point in this election, isn't race the central political issue? Religious issue. Isn't it the central religious issue? And shouldn't we, along with all the other complex dimensions to this time of racial reckoning, shouldn't we be saying, look, if we're going to really address the heart of the racial questions and challenges and reckoning that is now before us, we have to understand that this is seen religiously and biblically, in addition to the economic and social, et cetera. And I think that can be helpful in enabling our folks to think more broadly about what are religious issues and what are the most important religious issues in this election. Third, I'd mention climate change. And here, I'd encourage us all to try to change the rhetoric away from all the policy debates. Do you believe in the new Green New Deal or not? And do you, jobs versus environment and all that stuff, including what we heard last night if you watched the vice presidential debates. And by the way, if any of you see a fly in my hair, please tell me so I could just bat it away. But the question about climate change for us in the church should be rooted in the biblical calling to the gift of God's creation. And we should help our folks see the issue through that frame. Now, that may not determine where one comes down on various policy positions, like should we be in the Paris Climate Agreement or not, and et cetera. But it should be our starting point. And should be how we'd encourage our folks to think biblically about this major issue. Similarly, I'm sure many of you have probably already addressed the issue of immigration in one way or another. Here again, it's become highly politicized, but I would encourage you to help folks be reminded. And on several of these issues, I might say there are if you preach from the lectionary, you're going to find lectionary passages that are going to allow you to open up into the kinds of questions I've been talking about. But for immigration, it might be helpful to remind folks that in the Old Testament or the Hebrew scriptures, the issue of how the challenge of our responsibility to show hospitality to the stranger is mentioned 35 times. And interestingly, the commandment to love our neighbor as ourselves, which gets picked up in the New Testament, you find that in the Old Testament maybe once or twice. So this emphasis on how do we welcome the stranger in our midst. Now, again, that doesn't solve the questions of legality and a whole host of issues, but it is worth setting the context that in our present time, legal refugees being admitted to this country has decreased in a way more dramatic than ever in the last 20, 25 years. The numbers are startling, and this is legal refugees that many of your congregations have supported, perhaps through Church World Service or other refugee resettlement programs. And I think, and it's also worth saying that this is a nonpartisan challenge because those of you who are Latinx or have Latinx members and neighbors will hear that under the Obama administration, some called him the deporter in chief. And it wasn't always a friendly picture under that Democratic administration. But the issue of immigrants and refugees needs to be seen again within that biblical context that at least frames how we enter into the debate. And then I'd also raise what may be a little more difficult question, but I think it's really important. It's the question of truth. The question of truth. I want to just remind you that the 9th commandment, thou shalt not bear false witness against your neighbor. This isn't just a commandment that says we shouldn't lie. This is a commandment that's framed in the basis of upholding community. It's thou shalt not bear false witness against your neighbor. And when you read the commentary and when you read the mishrash, what rabbis and others and then Old Testament scholars, they'll point to how this was so important for preserving the integrity of the community, to not defame and lie against one who was your neighbor. That's a challenge to all across the political spectrum. It happens to be a very serious transgression of our present president, but it's not limited to him, and it's not a partisan matter. So again, I'd simply say those are examples of issues which I think can be incorporated into your preaching and also into your adult education and other ways that help at least try to frame the questions we're facing from how we should think as Christians. And the ones I just mentioned happen to be voter suppression, racial reckoning, climate change, immigration, and truth. There are others you could easily add to that. You'll still get parishioners who are going to say to you, you're just getting into politics. My response when I have had that is, well, actually, I'm trying to get into the Bible. Actually, that's what I'm trying to do here. Now, I wanted to say a few words about this whole challenge of addressing what are called these issues. There's a lot of nervousness about, what can we and can't we do as churches, even legally, and what should be our approach? What if we want to offer adult education classes? Can we offer an adult education class on issues in the election? Can we? Just what can we do? Well, I want to say clearly that part of our pastoral task should be to help those in our congregations bring their biblical and theological understandings into their action in the public square and into their voting. And I want to say a bit here about separation of church and state. Carrie mentioned some of my background, but I started my career as the chief legislative assistant to Senator Mark Hatfield, who was an evangelical Christian and an opponent of the Vietnam War. And I worked with him for about 8 or 10 years. And frequently, we dealt with these kinds of questions. The separation of church and state is never meant to separate moral and religious values from understanding our commitment to the common good. It's meant to say that the state cannot impose any one religious practice or understanding on society. Sometimes, and I'll say in this case, those on the Democratic side of the aisle, I'll be very frank. I've seen many candidates who basically never want to talk about religion unless it's the fourth Sunday in October, and then they'll go to a black church and suddenly become very religious. The Republicans, on the other hand, are very willing to talk about religion, but often according to a select number of issues. I think we need to nurture an approach that makes clear that we bring to our voting a set of moral and biblical understandings. Now, we don't pretend to impose those on anyone, but we can also share openly why it is that we have our particular convictions or why it is that we have particular questions. And then we can find common ground with those who come from different religious traditions or those who have no religious convictions. So that's at least the direction I'd say in answering this question of, well, Pastor, what can we, can we even talk about politics? Can we even talk about, of course you can talk about those issues, but I think it's helpful to have those understandings clear. That raises the third and last issue that I want to share briefly, and that's the legal questions. And this is pretty important. The Internal Revenue Service is the agency that has a set of regulations about what is possible and what is prohibited for 501c3 organizations, and that includes churches. What is prohibited is what is called political intervention. And political intervention means speaking or acting on behalf of or against a candidate for office. That's what is prohibited. A church, its pastor, or a 501c3 organization like Sojourners cannot speak for or against a candidate for office. However, those who are in leadership in a church, like you as a pastor, or one who is leading a 501c3, the IRS makes clear that they can speak in their own personal capacity in favor of a candidate or against a candidate if they so choose. But that must be clearly done as their own and stated in their own personal capacity, cannot use the grounds or the resources of an organization to do so, and cannot imply that the church or organization which they lead in any way is making a political commitment. Now, in fact, this is done a lot. In many traditions, there are pastors in an election. You find this in the African-American community, but in the Latino community, I have a good friend right now who's a leading Latino pastor who's involved making a political endorsement. And they have to be very clear that they're doing this in their own capacity. They're not, for instance, in this case, they don't speak from their church. They don't put anything in their church newsletter. They don't use any resource of the church or of their organization. They do this on their own. And then that's allowed. And frankly, that's happening more frequently in this election than it has happened in other elections because of the way in which there's so much gravity felt at this time. Now, that's a legal definition. I could go into specific cases because I had to do this in my capacity as chair of the board of Sojourners and figuring out what we could or couldn't do. But I also would be the first one to say what's legally possible is one thing, what's pastorally wise is another thing. And that all of us have to carefully weigh that. So those are the comments I wanted to make, Carrie. And I think I'd like to stop there and see if you have questions or if there are points that I could go into further in dialogue, and to hear what your challenges are and what you're really facing. I'd circle back to where I started. I know this is a terribly difficult time for any pastor for the reasons that I've stated. And I really wish you discernment and courage and wisdom in what you decide to do as you go into the pulpit, as you go into an adult Sunday class, or as you speak at an event in the neighborhood, as you decide whether or not to put a sign in your yard. All of these questions, I want to be helpful in any way that I can. So thank you very much.
The first question we have that came in, Wes, is seeking suggestions of how we might frame race biblically in a way that a white congregation that has issues with overt racism might be able to hear.
Yeah. First of all, I want to say that you probably know there are a lot of resources now, biblically and theologically, around this question that you can find. I find that one of the most helpful is to go to what was actually an early creed of the church. There's neither slave or free. There's neither male or female. And we would add to that a racial dimension because we are all one. It turns out that verse is really capturing one of the earliest baptismal creeds in the church. And the historical and biblical work makes pretty clear that one of the dramatic features of the early church was its ability in its own nature to overcome economic and racial and gender divisions that predominated in the Roman Empire, in the prevailing society. So there's a wealth of ways to look at several passages in the New Testament which really uncover this. You can also find some really helpful resources. I'm biased because of my association with Sojourners, and Jim Wallace's book 3 or 4 years ago, America's Original Sin, continues to be really helpful for white Christians to come to grips with understanding race in a theological way. But those are some directions that I'd encourage you to investigate.
We have another biblical theological framing question regarding the coronavirus pandemic and public health issues. Thoughts on that?
Yeah. If you mean how to, I assume it means like how to address that question in a theological way.
Yes.
I've been doing some workshops for congregations that it's based on a book that Pat Kiefert and I recently did called "How Change Comes to Your Church," and we've been exploring the dynamics that are facing congregations now, and especially those that are trying to cope with COVID-19. And one of the questions we've asked in that context is this: what is God up to? What is God up to? Now, I think all of us would be the first to say that COVID-19 has not come to us as any act of God. It has happened. It's happened as part of this complex creation in which we live. But in the midst of that, what is God's Spirit doing? And I think one thing that God is up to in the midst of this crisis is lifting to the surface the realities that are present in our society, the ways in which COVID-19 is having such a disproportionate effect on people of color and on those who are in more marginal situations. Where I live in New Mexico, we see this so dramatically in the Navajo reservation, for instance. And I think it's like this is an occasion to see more deeply the truth of the conditions that we find ourselves in, and what God would have us do and respond as a result. And I feel that one helpful thing in trying to help congregations think about COVID-19 is to say, okay, we're not going to blame God for this, but we can ask, what can God teach us in the midst of this? And I think there's some pretty important lessons that we could learn.
Thank you for that. I think the God questions are always helpful when we get mired in that space. Mm-hmm. Someone is asking, does the prohibition on speaking for or against a candidate also extend to issues that may be on a ballot? And what about issues that are not on a ballot but are clearly becoming important in a particular election?
No, the prohibition does not extend to that, and that's extremely important to understand. Any church or any 501c3 nonprofit organization can address issues that face the society and that are being discussed in the midst of an electoral context, as long as they're speaking to the particular issues and not speaking for and against a particular candidate. Now, I mean, it may be that the position of candidates on such an issue are disparate and very clear, and you may be giving emphasis to one side of that, but as long as you're addressing the issue, you're fine. And that's not only allowed, but in fact, for many 501c3 organizations, that's really part of their vocation. I mean, if you're a 501c3 dealing with immigration and refugees, you're going to be speaking to this all the time, but you can't translate that into advice to vote for or against a particular candidate. And it's the same way for a church. I mean, you can have, you could preach a sermon on race, you could preach a sermon on climate, you could have an adult education, class on immigration, et cetera, and go into these issues however you wish, and hopefully from a deep biblical and theological way, and you're doing your vocation. It's when you cross that line that the IRS calls political intervention, which means, therefore, we should be for this candidate, or therefore we could never support that candidate, et cetera. Then you've crossed a line that is prohibited.
You touched on climate again, and our next question actually comes on the topic of climate. From a lay speaker in the United Methodist Church who is also a passionate environmentalist. His question is, how to address the passage, "Be fruitful and multiply and have dominion over the earth," as it seems to sanction doing anything to creation, no matter how damaging the action may be?
I'm really reluctant to say this, but I wrote a book on that. and it was earlier in my career, I became convinced that the church was neglecting our call to take care of the earth. Environmental, if you go back to the history of the environmental movement and to Earth Day, 1970, your former Senator Gaylord Nelson was one of the leaders in Earth Day. And you don't find a single religious voice involved in the early demonstrations and advocacy and work around Earth Day. Senator Gaylord Nelson didn't have any pastors, didn't have any theologians. North American theology, for the most part, was just, these questions were absent. And since that time, there's been a tremendous discovery of all the things we've neglected in the Bible, and all the calls that place our relationship to creation at the heart of God's concern and love. The passage that you quote is, in fact, the passage used most frequently by secular environmentalists who, especially in the 70s and 80s, were quick to blame Christianity for all the environmental problems in the world. And they had a point, because Christians weren't very attentive to this. But once you go, if you really want to go into a biblical understanding, now there are reams of books and organizations that help you do this. The book I happened to write early on was called A Worldly Spirituality, A Call to Take Care of the Earth. There's been a whole lot more since then that has gone into these matters very deeply. Larry Rasmussen, who's a friend of mine in my church here in Santa Fe, has written perhaps the best book of all, called Earth Honoring Faith. if you really want to read a deep and persuasive book. But just from the passage you cite, you just read a few verses later, and you see how we are called to tend to the earth and take care. And the translation of the Hebrew best reads to repair and care for the creation that God has given us. So one mustn't take that single text and use it as a kind of proof text for saying Christianity simply teaches a role of domination over the earth. It's not at all the case. There's I think it was Zondervan who even came out with a green Bible. They printed a Bible, and every verse, I have a copy actually, every verse that deals with God's concern for creation is printed in green, like a red letter Bible. This is a green letter Bible. And you just go through those pages and it's full. So that would be my encouraging response to you.
We have a question about endorsing candidates on social media.
Mm-hmm. It's a great question, and again, the same rules apply. Social media gets a little trickier. Here's how it works. If you have, let's say you're a pastor, and let's say you have a private Facebook account, and you post something there which says, let's take it on one side of the aisle, that says, I watched the debate last night and I was so grateful for what Vice President Pence said about being pro-life. That's certainly where I'm going to cast my vote. Well, if it's a private Facebook account and you speaking in that way, that's fine. If you used your church Facebook account to do that, you would be in violation of IRS regulations. And if in your, let's say Facebook or Twitter, if you decide to make a statement that really is in effect an endorsement of a candidate, you then should simply add that line that you see sometimes in these lists of petitions and so forth. I'm speaking in my own personal capacity. Just that satisfies the IRS, that if you add that, should you choose to make a political endorsement in social media. But again, it gets even, I'll give you an example from the IRS. There was a president of a hospital. No, I'm sorry, it was a president of a university who had a column in the university's newsletter to the alumni. And in that column, he said, as we approach this election, there are issues of education that are very important, and I'm speaking in my own personal capacity, but I'm really advising that we support X candidate. What he advocates would be much better for the university. And then the president went even so far as to reimburse the university for a certain portion of sending out that newsletter to the alumni. However, the IRS said he's in violation because he was using a resource of the university to make a political statement. So you see, in social media, it's very important what platform you use and then how you choose to identify yourself.
So on that note, it sounds like it's not splitting hairs to make sure we're using our own personal devices when we're doing that. So not logged in on the church computer, for example.
That is very, again, it does almost sound like splitting hairs, but I don't, I think I could share this. You wouldn't mind the president of Sojourners, Jim Walls. The reason why I got into all these issues is that Jim decided for the first time in his career, as other leaders have done, he was going to endorse a candidate, in this case, Vice President Biden. We had to figure out what that meant for Sojourners. And we took a very conservative approach. And it meant that Jim got a new email address, a new email account, and a separate computer that was not a Sojourners computer in order to do that portion of work that was work endorsing a particular candidate. Now, that's taking things to maybe an extreme, but we were being very, very careful. And so it's exactly the point that you've raised.
Okay. We have a COVID-related question coming in. Lots of folks, especially here in Wisconsin, are using the just have faith and stop living in fear theme. Just go ahead and live your life. We can't live in fear forever. And this person is asking for ways to address that. They feel like they're running out of ways to respond gracefully.
Yeah, I really understand that. There is, at one level, it resonates because we know overall in this time, one of the most important words we can hear is fear not, be not afraid. I think, I think we're living in an election period where fears are being manipulated, and so this does make it complex because there's some truth in saying we shouldn't be afraid, but there's a difference between not being afraid and trusting ourselves ultimately to God's providence and being foolhardy in ways which endanger others. And if we're working with our parishioners, we want to encourage them not to be imprisoned by fears when we can trust in a loving God. But we also know that because of the nature of COVID-19, this is an intensely communitarian disease. I mean, when you hear this phrase, community spread, this is a disease that it affects communities, and because it affects communities, it then impacts individuals. And what I would do is really raise up the responsibility as Christians to bear our own, to love our neighbor and to bear our responsibility for the community in which we live. And that is part of how we demonstrate our loyalty to God and the depth of our faith. It's really, it's really troubling to see how the tradition of rugged individualism, which is so deep in our culture, but which, is really antithetical to the deepest understandings of our faith, how that's getting in the way and in causing us to assert our own autonomy in ways that have the capacity to harm others. I like to say this. Christian faith is personal. It's personal, but it's not individual. There are no Robinson Crusoe Christians. Being called to Jesus Christ is being called to a body and being called to participate in God's love for the community. And that's where I think we have to help our folks understand that this attractive, defiant individualism. Let's just not be fearful and just go out and live our lives. It really goes against our commitment to love our neighbor.
Thank you for that. As a longtime ecumenist, I wonder if you could give a few moments to talking about the practice of praying for our elected officials. I know so many of our traditions have a variety of commitments to that, from those who have very defined prayers in that regard and others who don't attend to it much at all. I wonder if you have any advice for communities that struggle with that practice.
Yeah, it's really interesting, Carrie. In this time of COVID-19, when we all are trying to decide uh, what to do in terms of our church practice, my wife and I have been meeting in person, outside, distanced, with one other couple, the same couple. He happens to be a retired Lutheran pastor and his wife, and I'm from the Reformed Church. And we meet and we talk about a text and about an issue, and then we have communion, and we call it our 4-person pod church, and that's how that's how we're trying to find some way of fellowship as we go forward. Last Sunday, the question that we posed was exactly that: how do we pray for the president? Um, and 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 it's really interesting. I picked up from Facebook the dialogue between 2 close friends of mine in the RCA, uh, one of whom was saying, um, I know what we're supposed to I know what we're supposed to do according to the Bible, but I'm not going to tell my people to pray for someone who is an abuser and who is causing trauma and suffering. We've got to deal with that first. And a response came from another person who said, I, I, I understand where you're coming from. And I will say the first person was a female pastor, and she was really relating to issues that she felt were in play, especially from the presidential debate. And the response, I could share this. It came from a good friend of mine who is a gay pastor, and in the RCA, it's been really a struggle as he's tried to get ordained. And he said, in my journey, I've had to learn that I must pray for those who I see as my enemies. That's the only way that I could survive. And just that dialogue, I think, picked up the tension that is with so many of us. Uh, I think that, yes, we are always called to pray for those who are in authority. And I respect those liturgical traditions that have those regular prayers. I think they're helpful. But I also remember what James Martin, who's a Catholic writer, is with America Magazine, a really fine, I would say a progressive Catholic spokesperson, very faithful to his tradition. And when President Trump was hospitalized with COVID-19, he said, yes, I'm praying for President Trump and his wife, just as I am praying for the other 846 persons who came down with COVID on the same day. And that's important to keep in mind as well.
We have no more questions in our queue right now. I wonder if you have any parting words for us today.
Oh my gosh. I hope this has been helpful. I really think, I'll tell you, 4 years ago, when President Trump was elected. I know that those of us on this call, we may have different political views, but I had a deep conversation with a friend. We were both, and with my son as well. We were shocked. And as I thought about it, I said, what if historians will look back on this time and say, it was in 2016, after this election, that the church in America began to recover a voice that wasn't tied to political powers of either side, but that was truly prophetic and truly rooted in a desire to be that alternative expression of God's kingdom, of God's preferred future. What if these external events become the occasion for the real recovery of the integrity of the church's witness within our political context? That's still the question I wonder about today. Because I think for the church, that really is at stake. And it's very difficult how we enter into the specific politics of this as pastors of churches where our congregations are divided politically. But I really think it is important to say the witness and integrity of the church is really at stake in this moment. As we face the election, as we face COVID, as we face racial reckoning, as we face all of this, we're being asked again, what does it mean to be the faithful people of God in this particular time? Which is always the question that our faith would ask of us as we seek to be loyal followers of Jesus Christ. So I just hope in the next 27 days and beyond and into whatever the next administration may be, we learn how to ask that question more deeply.
Wes, thank you so much for all you've shared with us today. I want to share with you just a couple of comments folks have left in the chat box because I think they're representative of what your listeners have gained today. One person has said, thank you for this time. It was informative and an inspiration. And another has shared that they're grateful for your perspective and experience and said, thank you for offering your wisdom to so many struggling to get through Sunday of each week.
Great. Well, thank you.
Thank you.
It's been a real honor.
God bless to every pastor and lay speaker striving to make it from Sunday to Sunday. You are in our prayers, and God bless and good health to you, Wes, as well, as we all seek to make it through these days.
Great. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Peace to you.
Peace to you all.